out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to La Pausa, our laid-back saunter through the history of South American football. Our first series is a collection of discussions entitled Encounters, wherein we consider the interactions between the game in South America and Europe. Sometimes friendly, occasionally ferocious, but always fascinating. My name is Stuart Horsfield, and I am delighted to say that the band has reformed for a new tour. So first of all, no prizes for guessing who's involved. All the original band members are back. So first of all, out of retirement, drummer, Mr. Steven Scragg. Steven, welcome.
Oh, looking forward to this. Chaos is guaranteed, I think.
Yeah, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it to the expert, because as we've established, there's a lot of people in this band who aren't very expert in a lot of things, but we do have one expert. So I am going to leave it to the expert right at the end to explain what this new series is in a little bit more detail. But obviously it's good to have you setting the beat and setting the tone, Stephen.
Yeah, I might be out of beat or out of step, but I'll just keep thrashing away in the background.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, when I said it, that's exactly what I was thinking. Next up, lead guitar, Mr. Gary Thacker. Gary, welcome.
Cheers, Stu. My guitar's hanging up on the wall, and that's the place it's going to stay, mate. I can walk past it and run my fingers across the strings, and that's about my lead guitaring. But great to be back. Start a new series. It's going to be fantastic.
Well, talking of which, let's sort of find out what we're going to learn. And what this is all going to be about. Finally, we have the lead singer of the band, the Freddie Mercury, if you like, of this quartet, Dr. Pete Watson. Pete, welcome back.
How you doing? Yeah, don't expect me to hit the high notes. Probably don't have those kind of tight trousers either, but I'm quite happy to be the prima donna on the stage if I can be. So,
well, all that bothers me is you don't lose your voice, because if you lose your voice, this is going to be an awfully short podcast. So this one was more your idea. So talk us through what we're going to be discussing over the coming episodes.
Yeah, so we've kind of named this Encounters. So this time we're kind of branching out, we're reaching out. And the idea is to look at the ways in which, through footballing history, South American countries have met the various European nations. And primarily we're going to focus on a lot of the encounters between South American football and British football. So this is going to involve today, if you want me to give away what we're talking about, we're going to talk about the first teams that toured South America to play football in the new world. But over the kind of coming weeks, we'll be talking about the tours of South American teams to Europe. We're going to be talking about some of the great kind of World Cup times teams from South America and the impression they made on Europe. And then we're going to look at, for example, some of the great encounters between England and Brazil, England and Argentina through history, and probably have a really good fun discussing all the kind of Copa Intercontinental matches that caused such controversy in various occasions, some of the bloody battles and controversies that went on there. So that's the plan. That's the aim. We'll probably kind of talk about cartoons and insult various football teams and go off on random tangents and musical or otherwise over the next 15 weeks or so. But that's what we're on about for this series.
I would hate for it to be any other way. So tour bus is full of fuel. Let's kick off. So as you mentioned, this first episode, we're looking at tours, predominantly British teams who go across to South America. We sort of start in 1904. It's very much not the tours that you associate at the moment, where the teams fly to Dubai or Saudi Arabia or America or China, and sort of it's a very different look and a very different aesthetic. So we kick off with your team, Pete. I believe they were the trailblazers that sort of set this going.
Yeah, you can't blame the South Americans for wanting to get the best example of world football at the time to come and show me how they do it. So they're absolutely spot on straight away. And as a Southampton fan, I think I've probably said this before. I say it on a lot of podcasts when I'm talking about South American football history and in lectures and in the pub. is that, really Southampton are responsible for South American football in the fact that they go to Argentina and Uruguay and teach them how to play. Charles Miller, formerly of Southampton, goes across and teaches Brazil how to play in Sao Paulo. So basically, it's all down to us. And it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of the comments that we see in the newspapers in Argentina are probably praising Southampton more than they've been praised at any time since for the type of football that they were playing on this tour. I mean, but what's really interesting is the reasons why they go. Is that they basically are looking for a team that will bring the science of football, to the benighted nation of Argentina. And again, remembering as well that these are professional teams in England at the time. They're looking for professional teams. But football in Argentina and Uruguay is very much amateur in nature. So this is really a case of a learning experience. And again, Argentina is looking to Europe and Uruguay as well, as they do in many other fields of culture and politics and so on, for learning. They're looking to move beyond their kind of backward status and find modern sport, which is seen as a very important part of modern culture, of European living, of improving the nation's race. And the kind of reports that we see in the old newspapers. At this point, we should say that there is an amazing blog or website called Viejos Estadios, Old Stadiums, which is incredible. It's an amazing resource who find all these old newspapers and tell about and pass us on what's been said. But basically, we have the reports saying we want to see modern football. We want to, we see the benefits of culture. We want to improve our men to become fitter, to become more healthy. And then we also see the importance of it being a spectacle. We see this as being a chance to make money and to learn. So all of these things is basically under Southampton's role as they travel across on a steamship for the very first time in 1904.
Wow, that's quite the pitch for Southampton. I am going to come to Stephen next because I fear he'll have something to say. So I'll let him hang fire on that. Gary, I'll come to you first. As always, Pete's given us a big opening, a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. I was very interested in his comment about bringing the science of football. My question here is to you, Gary, is what would you perceive to be the science that they were looking for from English clubs at the turn of the century? Not because I think you were there. I need to make that clear. I'm just making that clear. I'm not saying that. That's just the first question I've written down.
I mean, it's a good question, and I mean, it's difficult to know the answer. I guess, as Pete says, it's very much the sort of England or Britain were seen as the pioneers of the game and missionaries when they went to South America to spread the word of good football and how to play football. And it's interesting if you look at the Southampton tour particularly is particularly interesting. Well, they're all very interested. The two of the, I don't know, 7 or 8 teams, probably actually more than that, went across. The Southampton was very, very interesting. They because the early tours, there were very few games that the travelling teams played against were club teams. A lot were representative teams. For example, Southampton's second game was against Argentina Britannicos. So it's interesting that they had, I would say, less of the clubs were playing the travel teams. That changed as you go through the years, the decades that we're going to be discussing. That changed a lot. But I think it was the pioneers of football in South America were predominantly British originally, and they were sort of trying to encourage the soft power of British football culture to sort of lead them to the promised land, as it were.
Stephen, obviously, as Pete has so eloquently put, Southampton were clearly the trailblazers of all South American football, and all South American football came to be. Closely following that was Nottingham Forest that then follow afterwards. Both teams go, and both teams win all their games. But I suppose another difficult question for you, but I'm just after your thoughts on the fact that it was Southampton and Nottingham Forest that blazed this trail, because they weren't sort of the preeminent sides, as much as Pete might disagree. They weren't the preeminent sides in English football, and yet these were the sides who decided to embark on this concept.
Yeah, there's a kind of Blackadder at play here. Blackadder goes fourth, I think. That great episode where he's kind of like trying to get out of going over the top, and he He gets in touch with, is it Haig he gets in touch with? And it's all kind of like reminding him of the Battle of Umbongo Gorge and the really sharp mango that, he saved him from and all that type of thing. There's a touch of Man in a Panama Hat about it. Come Marcus Brody in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He's what, 2 days ahead of the game. He knows every custom and ritual from here to the end of the earth. He'll blend in. If any luck, he's already got the Grail. But in reality, he gets lost in his own museum. There is a great element of I think the outstanding misadventure that's just the greatest adventure as well. There is a wonderfully accidental heroism at play here. But I don't know, it kind of reminds. I mentioned this trip to Japan that I did, and I don't think I've mentioned it, but when I was in Nagasaki, Vivarium were winning promotion the night Vivarium were winning promotion, and I was in the bowels of the stadium, and it was one of those kind of like, why am I here? How the hell did I get here? And there has to have been a little bit of that about all this. I ended up on Japanese national television interviewing the owner of Vivarium, who's notoriously kind of like anti-media and just doesn't want anything to do with Japanese media. But because this Englishman had tipped up, suddenly it was kind of like, well, hang on a minute, I need to be interviewed by this Englishman. And yeah, the cameras all burst in, and it was kind of that. I like to think, I'm the Southampton and Nottingham Forest of TFT in that respect. But yeah, this is definitely Man in a Panama Hat. It's Marcus Brody. It's all of these things, and more. I don't mean that as an insult either. I mean this as the utmost in complimentary terms.
Marcus Brody is as you will now be known as. Stephen, Gary, do you agree? Do you agree with the Indiana Jones analogy?
I mean, I'm glad Steve's up and running with his metaphors and the analogies. We're up and running. The series now is officially underway. Yeah, it's interesting, that the clubs who went. I mean, because these guys didn't just sort of, Southampton and Forest didn't just sort of. I tell you what, let's go and pop over to South America, see if anybody wants a game. That's not how it happened. I'd be interested. I know Pete knows the answer to this. I promise. I would assume that the people who are playing football in Argentina and in Uruguay, Brazil later on, made the contact with the clubs, sort of, and asked them to come over rather than the other way around. I would guess. I don't know if that's the case. It'd be interesting if Pete knows the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, it varies from tour to tour. The Southampton one, I don't know exactly how it happened, but there are links between the first Argentine Football Association, the first AFA. There are two incarnations of it. With Britain, with the Football Association, there are links there. It actually, out of interest, one of the kind of political links is one of the people that is organising the tour from the Argentinian side is related to the then Argentinian president. So there are political, issues there. I know that sometimes they contacted the FA directly to ask for recommendations. And we see a little bit of the kind of old boys club there. And certainly the Exeter tour in 1914, the then kind of head of the FA, Frederick Wall, is friends with one of the directors or chairman of Exeter, MJ McGahey. And that's part of the reason that they're contacted. I mean, I wonder to some extent whether the kind of port link is a major issue with Southampton, because, again, the steamliners that are travelling from Britain to Buenos Aires are going from Southampton. That's where they leave from. So it's an important port city at the time. A lot of British people, will have been involved in some kind of aspect with trade. And again, a lot of the people, as Gary's already said, that have set up the first football clubs and are playing against Southampton, Nottingham Forest, and pretty much the teams in the first kind of 5 or 6 years of the tours, a lot of them have British surnames. See, I wouldn't be surprised if there are kind of merchants or, these kind of clubs have interest with Southampton in some kind of way. I don't know. I would love to dig up the kind of old files and communications. Certainly what we then start to have is the Argentinians and Uruguayans to a lesser extent. The Argentinians, I think, are always really pushing the tours. And because Montevideo is just across the River Plate, they get games as well. But they start asking for slightly better teams. So Southampton, as we've said, were not one of the preeminent clubs, even though they had been FA Cup finalists in 1900 and 1902, lost on both occasions. The pain never ends. They were one of the Southern League kind of lights, but then in the second year they wanted a better team. So they asked for Nottingham Forest, who were then a first division team but were struggling. Actually got relegated the year after they toured. But Nottingham Forest also saw the advantage of earning some money, because I think they'd had a fire in their ground. So we're looking to raise funds, and Southampton had certainly made money out of it. And you see this kind of process of what Argentina want in terms of trying to improve their own football, trying to get more of a spectacle, trying to get better teams, because then we see Everton and Spurs come. But then we get teams that they want to try and beat, because the first kind of 4 English teams that go win very convincingly pretty much every game they play against the Argentine and Uruguayan opposition. So then we see teams like Swindon and then Exeter City coming over, who they think they might have a better chance of beating. So there's a kind of a change in what's going on. I think what's interesting is the diplomatic issues as well. One of the things that I picked out is that another reason why they wanted to get the English clubs over was that there was a border dispute with Chile going on at the time. King Edward VII was mediating this particular border conflict. So, there was a kind of a political idea to get a Southampton team over as a way of improving diplomatic relations, of hosting them, of showing them to be very modern, of trying to curry favour with Britain in some kind of way by hosting them so well. And there's always this huge effort by the Argentine society. We are talking about elite society in the pre-war tours anyway, of trying to show the British teams the best possible time they could have, of welcoming them, of giving them entertainment, of taking them to all the highlights of Buenos Aires and the surrounding areas, in order to make sure these relations were really important. And historically they were. There's been various books about how Britain influenced the kind of informal empire due to its trade power in the likes of Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and certain other kind of the other South American nations. So there's a lot of diplomacy going on as well.
There you go, see, Gary. Already we've got it into politics, and we're only about 10 minutes into the new series, and clearly,
Game on.
What sort of started out, and it's something we'll come to in a couple of minutes, about this almost missionary ideal that is being put forward here obviously from a football context. But Gary, it's your thing, but politics, even way back, football is heavily involved in this, and is seen as a medium by which to engage other countries, engage in talks, maybe engage in trade, and even then it was 110, 115 years ago, football was still being used and manipulated, you could argue.
Yeah, I mean, there's been strong links between Argentina and Britain. I mean, if memory serves me right, I think that Britain tried to occupy Buenos Aires in the early 1800s, 1806, 1807, something like that. Yeah, and so, I mean, the interest in South America has been, strong in the UK for an awful long time. And, it's developing that sort of relationship only had advantages for the Brits as well. I mean, the sort of, we talk about the soft power, not the sort of military power, but the cultural power, the financial power, was very much a strong point of the UK, of Britain in South America. And therefore, for Argentina, have always been, and Pete's mentioned this in the previous series we've done, Argentina was very much looking across the Atlantic rather than into the South American hinterland for their sort of definition of who they should be, who they want to be. And I think that's probably, a nice sort of nexus between the politics of Argentina, the aspirations, and the football tours.
It's an interesting point you made there right at the end, guys. I'm going to come to Stephen on this, because Stephen talks a lot, or I've been in podcasts where Stephen's talked a lot about this. And he talks about Liverpool as being a city that looks out to the sea rat for its influences. And I guess, Stephen, you probably, I want to say more than Pete, but Pete's clearly got his own agenda today for this. And that's fine. He can push Southampton as much as he likes. But, but for you, Stephen, I guess you could probably relate to certainly what Gary's just said there, and what Pete's talked about as well, in how Argentina is a very forward-thinking, outward-looking nation in terms of how to develop in all aspects, not just football.
Yeah, I know we talked on other series of South America files about how that hierarchy comes into play, and that I don't know, kind of like aspiring nature of Argentina of looking across the Atlantic towards kind of British or European influence, and being ahead of the rest basically, and this all just ties into it. The fact that Argentina, Uruguay, beat Brazil to the punch as far as getting British teams over to play football. It just properly it all plays into that. And I think Pete's got a huge valid point earlier with Southampton. Again, another port city that will by nature look to the sea. The mysteries of what lies beyond the water, and what we have got on our shore, and we can take it to other places. And seaports tend to be sponges of information, and just learning, and influence, and wide influences. I've walked through many a city and got a very similar feel to how it feels in Liverpool. Whether that's throw Belfast into the Newcastle can have that feel to it. Glasgow, there's so and Amsterdam, Hamburg, Nagasaki. They've all got that kind of element of looking out to sea and being able to kind of like soak in what is out there. Rather than looking to the hills. And Argentina and Buenos Aires, it's right there on the River Plate, and Montevideo will do exactly the same, but maybe always playing that little bit of catch up in terms of learning. But I mean that's always the fascination with that relationship between Buenos Aires and Montevideo. It's Montevideo that becomes the power base because of what they do on that rectangular patch of grass via the Olympics, via the World Cup. That 1930 World Cup final is so pivotal in that, the way that we view, early South American football. And, these tours are a huge part in that, an absolutely huge part in that. And the fact that Buenos Aires is, such an epicenter of this emerging culture is no surprise.
Another little quick question for you, Stephen. Have you had the same feelings when you've walked through Hull?
My biggest take on Hull, I once saw a dog outside the KC Stadium dressed in Hull City home kit before the match, and then walking away from the ground after the match back to the car, it was wearing the away kit after the match. And that speaks volumes.
That answers my question then, doesn't it? Clearly, I want to say backward looking, but yeah, outward looking. Okay, that's good. I just wanted to double check on that. Pete, just one more point. I mean, obviously, we'll touch on all of these tours as we go through, but as we start to look at some of the other topics. But one sort of point of note is how, not how long it takes, because this is quite a condensed period of time when you look at it over the entire century. But Brazil seems to be missing from the itinerary in a lot of these early tours compared to, obviously, Argentina and Uruguay.
Yeah, no, they do. I mean, and also they're not getting the professional teams either. So there's two things that they're missing out on. I mean, the first time that a team tours Brazil, is actually a South African FA trip in 1906. And they stop off with Rio and Sao Paulo. And then you have two amateur team tours where Corinthian FC will tour in 1910 and 1913. And then actually in the same year, we get a combined Portuguese team of players from Benfica, Sporting Lisbon and Internacional touring, which is kind of largely forgotten in the history books. But I mean, you have a couple of problems with Brazil, I suppose, in the fact that they do have the same kind of commercial links with Britain. Britain, again, is very important. But you have two centres of Brazilian football at the time. You have Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, which impedes, I suppose, a joint force of communication with them. They're also slightly later. If you look at when kind of football teams are founded in Argentina, Brazil is slightly later. I wonder if it's just because Buenos Aires and to a lesser extent Montevideo are working as one sole pillar of the football, which is why it's easier to host them over. But it is interesting that they do get the amateur teams first, and I think it's something that Brazil did not resent but struggled with. They were very much trying to get a professional team to tour them, and it actually isn't until Exeter City tour them in 1914, where they get that first professional team. And again, Exeter are a team in the Southern League, not a particularly strong team in that Southern League, but they're the first time. And actually, that's seen as being the first time, an actual Brazil representative team is actually formed, when members of players from both Sao Paulo and Rio get together, and they actually beat Exeter 2-0. I mean, we could go on to talk about all the other countries. The other countries are even later. It's not, for example, until 1926 when Chile and I think Peru play their first games against European opposition. That's Espanyol from Spain, who are the first team to tour them. Real Madrid actually visit Peru, Cuba, and Mexico the following year. And again, the likes of Colombia is not till a lot later. It's not till 1952 that. Well, actually, it's probably a bit earlier than that. We've got a Hungarian team of kind of random refugees, the Hungaria FC, who then become Samarios and actually play in the Colombian League, are arguably the first team of touring Europeans to go to Colombia. And then we have Real Madrid in 1952. I think Ecuador, and again, I might need to check this, but it looks like the first team to tour there is a Swedish team called Degerfors, which is not until 1953, I think. That's going back through this kind of website that I've tracked down. Paraguay, I think, again, is maybe 1954 when Partizan Belgrade turn up. And Venezuela, it's 1932. Again, I think it's a German team, Karlsruhe. So, so it's interesting to see. I mean, it's really random, some of the teams that are travelling across to play and where they're going to. It's quite a fascinating... you wonder what the stories were. What impelled Karlsruhe to head to Venezuela? Why did Degerfors think, I know, let's go off and play in Ecuador? I mean, they played a couple of other places as well. They played in Colombia too. But, you just think, what was going on with those clubs? What prompted it? Who was driving it? And you'd love to hear, you'd love to try and track down the diaries and read the kind of stories and newspaper reports for some of those teams as well.
It's a great segue, actually, Gary, because my next question for you is another tricky one. We talked about this sort of at the beginning when Pete was sort of kind enough to send us across some potential points to look at, but obviously one of them being, football missionaries. Now, obviously missionaries, as we know, certainly as I know them, spreading the word of God is a very selfless vocation. Would you class these teams, the Southamptons, the Nottingham Forest, the Exeter Cities, the Tottenhams, the Evertons, would you class them as missionaries for the good of the game, for the benefit of, I want to say mankind, but for the benefit of South American development? Or do you think maybe that's a little bit strong to categorise them as missionaries?
I wouldn't say it was a little bit strong. I'd say it's massively strong. I mean, if you're approaching the players of these clubs and, in Southampton or Nottingham or Liverpool, London, wherever, and you say, can you come across to South America to help the growth of the game? Yeah, okay. That's going to happen, isn't it, really? I mean, you're not talking about hopping on a transatlantic jet, these days. I mean, we're talking about massive commitments and, times away from home. So I guess it's the short answer. I think is no, Stu. I think perhaps the perception of the South American, Argentina and Uruguay were the sort of first visitors for the professional teams were perhaps looking at as missionaries and sort of looking to as teachers almost, perhaps rather than missionaries, perhaps a better description. But from the club's point of view, I'm sure the money making or the favours they could earn, or perhaps looking at potential players or opportunities was far more of a sort of driving force than let's go and spread the word, as it were.
I'm going to come to you in a second, because obviously, hopefully you'll have some information that will support this debate. Stephen, another little tricky question for you. Do you think this was deemed or seen as an opportunity to exert dominance on the perspective of the English football clubs? And again, Pete might have some quotes and some sources to back this up, but certainly from your opinion, it's okay going as missionaries or teachers and looking to develop. But do you think that perhaps this was also an opportunity to exert superiority? Because as Pete mentioned, Southampton were in the old Third Division South. I mean, there's a fair few teams above them yet before they get there.
Completely and utterly, it's very much as Gary said, chance to make some money. And at the same time, it's kind of like we've given this sport to the world, And let's just ensure that, everyone still knows that, who are the overlords. There's very much, a case in that. I think there's no doubt about it. You don't have to look at cricket as a juxtaposition to that. It's exactly the same. Modern Olympics, it's going out there and proving that, here's the master race, and and that's the way it's going to stay. Obviously, it doesn't stay that way, but at this point in time, this is an unsuspecting British public, and their place in the world it's a lot more precarious than they realise.
I like that. Yeah, I like that. Pete, obviously, you're the man with the knowledge, the perceptions of these clubs coming across. Gary made a point about maybe it was more from a teaching perspective or coaching perspective, if you like, rather than sort of as to be seen as work of the Lord or missionaries as we know them. Obviously, if the countries are asking, or society is asking for, looking out to see who they can learn from, but what was their perception once these teams started to arrive?
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic the first team are the Saints, aren't they? The true football missionaries. I honestly thought both Gary and Steve would get that. I was thinking, can I hold out for that one? I mean, you've got a couple of both Gary and Steve have made some really valid points about what's there. I mean, I think that from the club's perspective, they are looking to make money. There is very little thought of potentially getting players, although there are a couple of clubs that apparently were interested in a couple of players they saw. Certainly Spurs see a guy in Rosario, quite impressed as them. And actually, apparently there were stories in the Rosario press in 1909 of maybe this player heading to London to play football. I mean, it wouldn't be another kind of 70 years until two Argentinians actually do that. So there is a little bit of that going on, but very little, But what I think you do have is a sense of we are going to teach them how to play. That is certainly part of what they're doing. And certainly I think the Argentinian press and the Uruguayan press are definitely looking for that. What you see clearly in the local newspapers, both the kind of the Spanish language newspapers, but also the British language newspapers, because there is the Buenos Aires Herald and the Standard, for example, which are reporting from a British expat perspective, is that they are talking about what can be learned. To the extent that, for example, after Southampton play a Uruguayan 11, the Uruguayan papers, and this is reported in Martin da Cruz's excellent book From Beauty to Duty, that the Southampton team, for their cleanliness and combinations, clearly prove that our game is a degenerate game. So we're looking. The Argentinian press and the Uruguayan press are looking to learn about what football is, and they're always talking about what it is that they should be learning. They're talking about what their players should be learning, and what they're mostly talking about in the early tours is the combinations, is the team playing as a team, not really playing as individuals. And this is where we see the first kind of stylistic contrasts emerging. What we often quite see is the British players and kind of officials also being asked about what their opinions are. And they tend to always speak about giving some information about saying, this is what they need to learn. This is how they can be better than us. They tend to do too many things individually. They tend to like the show, but they don't load to play as a team. And once they learn that, they'll be very good. There are certain teams that do talk about deliberately going out to teach them. And that originally is accepted quite well. But after the First World War, when the teams start coming again from 1922 onwards, we start seeing the Uruguayans and Argentinians saying, we don't actually have anything to learn from these teams anymore. So when Third Lanark go across in 1923, the South Americans are not very impressed. And the same happens with Motherwell. The kind of a former Liverpool player, actually, who was the then coach of Motherwell, a guy called John Sailor Hunter, talks about them coming across to teach the game. And the Argentinian press says, well, you have nothing to teach us anymore. I mean, there's lots of really interesting examples of this. There's on the Nottingham Forest tour, it's the type of things that they're learning. They're supposed to be learning fair play and sportsmanship as well. But increasingly, what we see happening is that the more physical, charging style of play. And I know we'll talk about rule differences and the different styles of playing, but the Argentine press do not see this as being part of what they believe scientific football to be, this kind of physical style of things. And then a very snooty kind of article in the Buenos Aires Herald, which comes, I picked this out from a book by a guy called David Downing, says, our Vespertine colleagues may not yet have realised that a game especially intended to improve the stamina and try the strength of young men in the prime of life is not necessarily a parlour game. We deprecate rough play, but we have an unshakable belief in the traditional fair play of English football teams. And what you also get is this nation of English superiority, which I think Steve was mostly talking about, the fact that by Britain going over and beating these little upstarts from the New World, it was a sign that Britain is still the best. And one of the problems that we have in the later tours, when Third Lanark go across, when Motherwell go across, and of course when Chelsea go across and really stink the whole thing up, is that they became this idea of we can't keep sending our teams to Uruguay and Argentina because they're getting beaten. And indeed, the standard says we have to stop doing this because actually they're creating a bad sense of how superior in sport we are. We're no longer superior, and that becomes a problem for British diplomacy and for that British sense of sport superiority. And I might even go as far to say, and again, we know about Frederick Wall and why England didn't play in that first World Cup in 1930. But I just wonder if the fact that Chelsea had been so poor and so kind of, they hadn't been respected at all, is when they thought we can't send an England team. What if we lose? Particularly when you've had the Uruguayan team doing very well in 1924, 1928, and the Argentinian teams beating Chelsea quite regularly on their particular tour. So, these are kind of the shifting sands of superiority and, teaching and, then the pupils becoming the masters. And there is a comic of that. There's a lovely comic strip of these British players turning up. I think it might be Plymouth Argyle that turn up apparently to teach these Argentinians how to play. And then after the match they play, we see it reversed with the Argentinians becoming the masters. So there is that constant sense of learning, but then, after World War I, we certainly see that they're not ready to learn anymore, and they're ready to actually teach themselves.
Gary, before I come to you, because I do feel like we need to discuss Chelsea's performance on the tour. But before we do that, anything you would like to say first?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I did a little bit of research. Yeah, I want to say lots before we talk about Chelsea, for God's sake. Yeah, I want to say how serious the clubs took the games, but they played a lot of games in a really short time. So just very briefly, Southampton played 6 games in 3 weeks. Forest played 8 games in 2.5 weeks. Everton played 5 games in 2 weeks. Spurs played 7 games in 2.5 weeks. Swindon played 8 games in 3.5 weeks. Exeter played 11 games in 5 weeks. I mean, I could go on, and it's that sort of thing. But it's interesting. A couple of quotes. Pete mentioned about how their sort of perception is. One of the things that Pete said about things to be a look at is how the importance, the national prestige of the South American countries was so important to them. And after I think it was Exeter travelled to South America, they got absolutely slated in a newspaper called the Tribuna, saying they were the most mediocre team of professionals sent out from the FA, from the home of the country. Actually, the home country football. Now, it's an interesting, if you look at actually Exeter's performances, they played, 7 or 8 games. They only lost 1 game, which was against an Argentina Combinada Norte side. So they didn't lose to a club team at all. In fact, no British club lost to a South American club until Third Lanark in 1923, when Independiente beat them 2-1 in June 1923. So, despite the South Americans saying they had little to learn and all this sort of thing, and interesting, another thing I noticed that Plymouth Argyle thrashed Uruguay 4-0 when I think they were either Olympic champions or soon to be Olympic champions, and only 6 years before they became the first World Cup winners. So, Plymouth Argyle, we're not talking the top team in the country. So it's really interesting to look at and consider perhaps, how seriously the British clubs went over there, and perhaps the continental clubs as well, viewed the games and the results of the games rather than the money-making possibilities of actually playing the games, and how the sort of perception of South American media promoted the success of South American clubs when it wasn't actually that successful. Alumni did beat the South African team, which was mainly made of British players, but that's not a club team. It was a sort of scratch side thrown together, mainly British players, but representing South Africa. So it's really interesting how the the development of the nationalism of South America tried to work, even when it wasn't really true, but still saying about the importance and how poor the British teams compared to the success of South American teams.
I've got so many questions now after that.
Uh-oh.
Right,
Sorry.
Gary, first of all, no. How seriously were Chelsea taking it then? If that's based on... So, played 16, won 5, drawn 3, lost 8.
Now, this is really interesting stuff. I mean, genuinely, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the early tours were against representative teams. And as the tours went on, the number of clubs that they played sort of grew. Swindon played 2 clubs. Exeter only played 1. Third Line played 2. Plymouth played 1. Motherwell played 3. Well, played Penarol twice, but played Boca as well. Whereas Chelsea, in their games, they played 7 South American clubs. The point I'm making here is that by 1929, the club game in South America had progressed so much. Chelsea played 16 games in 6 weeks, so I don't know how serious they were taking it. And let's face it, they weren't that great a team anyway. But Chelsea travelled, not only did they play that many games, they also travelled back and forwards from Argentina and Uruguay, but also the last 4 games they played in Brazil as well. So it was a sort of tour of games rather than a tour of competitive games, if I'm saying that. But there's no doubt 8 wins in those games for the South American teams, and of them they played 7 clubs. Just shows a difference from in the early tours when there was less sort of clubs playing the touring teams.
Okay, Stephen, this is your first tee up. Does Gary sound like a Chelsea fan to you? Do you think much changed in the last 100 years of Chelsea fans' perceptions of their club?
It felt like a lot of brushing under the carpet there.
Because it was. That's why.
I fully expect that Ron Chopper Harris was sent off in half of these games, and that Peter Bonetti spilled the ball for in one of them and all that type of stuff. I was this is where I was expecting it to go after that. I was kind of here it comes.
For you, Stephen, just one quick. I mentioned to Gary about how early sort of political inference came into these tours and were assigned to these tours. And then here, clearly, it doesn't take long either before football is used as well, essentially as propaganda. Gary used the word, and he's absolutely right. Propaganda is now used, as we've seen so eloquently by Gary from the English side. And I'm going to come to Pete in a minute about how the press changed over this time period. But for you, Stephen, again, football is even back then. It seemed that nations, people, administrators, whoever you like, were quick to see the propaganda value of football.
Absolutely, it's emboldening the national image. It's there's a serious amount of massaging of egos going on. To be able to beat a team from the cradle of the round ball, or perceived to be the cradle of the round ball, and you've got kind of like here's South America now saying that you can't teach us anything, but you've also got kind of English clubs, the FA, pulling up the drawbridge and taking the ball home. This is it's no coincidence that here's the Chelsea tour. It's the first time that the balance of payments on wins, draws and defeats. This is the first time that a British team goes to South America and comes away nursing more defeats than victories, and it's the last time they go.
Well, that was a full stop, wasn't it? With an exclamation mark thrown in at the end. Pete, for you, I just want to, for you then, obviously these tours as we're looking at, I think they cover 1904 to sort of 1929. So we're looking at 25 years, which quarter of a century is a long time. I personally am interested in how the South American press, you mentioned earlier about how a lot of questions were asked in these early tours. They looked to the English clubs, they looked at English performance, looked at what they could learn, and questions were being asked. The newspapers were reporting on this, but how did press perception change between Southampton and Chelsea?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I think the first thing to say is that you have 2 types of press. A lot of the press that has been reported in some of the books that people might have read, things like Passion of the People by Tony Mason and things like that, have tended to report on the British language press, the Buenos Aires Herald and things like that. Now, they provide really a parochial British viewpoint. So you have really them holding the line of the empire, or the old empire, the notions of empire, in the way that they're talking about these British teams, and very much defending the role and the way they're playing and the attitude. I think there's a very different attitude that comes from the South American native press, for example, the Viejos Estadios website talk about. And I think one of the things that they tend to focus on is behaviour. That there is expectations that the British should be playing a sporting, fair, clean, noble game. And this is something which persists for a very long time. It's something we'll talk about when we talk about the referees that travel across to South America. There is a perception that British play a noble, fair and clean game. So what we start to notice really from the Nottingham Forest tour onwards is increasingly the South American press taking note of the violent play or the physical play of the British players. And this is where I think sometimes we get the idea that the British players may have been trying harder than they might have been saying. Certainly Southampton were perceived to be taking it easy in quite a lot of games they'd played. You know, after they'd scored 8 or so against Argentina or the Argentinian 11, you know, they tend to take it a little bit easy. But what you start seeing is more instances of charging, of violent play, of some fouls, of less than noble play being reported by the South American press. And they start kind of picking this out as being a defect. And again, we have these rule differences. Certainly Nottingham Forest, the first team blamed for this, but certainly, you know, Exeter very, very much get criticised very heavily. You know, Gary was talking about the press reaction to Exeter, and it's almost entirely because of the way they played. It was seen as being unsporting. And part of this is due to the fact that the game in Argentina at the time is still an amateur game. In the pre-war years anyway, we don't really have much of the kind of the shady professionalism, the amateurism, the kind of professionalismo marron. It's still seen as being an amateur game with amateur ideals, and fair play is very much part of that. So that becomes more and more an idea. I think what we also see is a close analysis of science and a close analysis of tactics. Southampton is seen as being playing a very efficient, very short passing game. Nottingham Forest is seen as being a little bit different with a slightly more direct play. But what we certainly see is the teams being evaluated by how scientific they were. And we see that there is more and more criticism, particularly after the war years, about the way that the English teams are playing is not seen as being as interesting, as scientific, as skillful. It's very organised, it's very machine-like. But we also see that type of narrative. And this is always put in counterpoint to is the flair and individualism and creativity of particularly the Rio Platense, the Rio de la Plata game, style of play, which is seen as being very Argentinian and Uruguayan, as being something that's shared by both. So that there is what we see in the press is a kind of a sense of differentiation being established, and that gets more and more embedded with each tour. And part of that style differentiation between what the British players are doing and what they're supposed to be doing, and then compared with how the South American game is developed, is very much designed or talked about in a kind of us way. You know, we start to see the national game, national styles, a sense of the football being played by these combination teams as being representative of a particular identity that is very different. And this is where we kind of get this sense of opposition, which is so important for football as a kind of national identity idea, is that we have a sense of style that is different from what we're seeing. You know, we might have learned from Southampton, we might have learned from Nottingham Forest, we might have learned from Chelsea, not Chelsea, sorry, didn't learn from them. We might have learned from Everton and Spurs. I'm going to keep going, Gary, sorry. We certainly learned from Everton and Spurs, for example, in different ways. But what we now have is our version of this, you know, and it's different and it's ours. So those kind of use of we, of our team, of us, you know, against this kind of rather monochrome, rather dull English football or British football certainly emerges. What's really interesting as well is that the Argentinian football starts comparing itself more to Central European football. We have a couple of very unusual teams. We have Teplice from the from Czechoslovakia, who go over and play in 1922 and apparently really wow the public with the type of football that Argentinians saw themselves as playing. And as in Mark Orton's book about football and national identity in Argentina, he talks about the importance of the Ferencváros team from 1929, who also go across and play in this kind of much more quick, speedy, short passing game. They even say that Racing, in a game that Ferencváros play against Racing, Ferencváros make Racing look like a Saxon team, look like an English team, because Ferencváros are faster, they're playing better football. So by 1929, it seems to be established that British football is less interesting. It's more factory, it's more industrial, it's more efficient, but it lacks that kind of flair. And increasingly, they see it as maybe lacking that kind of sense of sportsmanship and fair play that is supposedly associated with British football.
Gary, it seems to me, again, from what Pete was saying there, that not so much the English game, but certainly the FA and maybe even English football as a whole were very much hijacked. And that's in the best possible term. It seems to me that the South Americans were incredibly smart. And whilst we thought we were going over there as missionaries and spreading the word, when actually South America was cherry picking from all the nations, picked all the best bits, and when there was nothing left to learn, went and found another nation and picked the best bits there, and so on and so on. And I suppose you have to question really where the true intelligence within the development of the game actually lay.
I guess it's if you're going to be a teacher, people learn. I mean, by definition, and if you're not, you're crappy teachers, aren't you? So I think by the time I'm forgetting it's Chelsea too. That's not really relevant. By the time
no, we're not forgetting it's Chelsea, guys.
Okay, let's keep it Chelsea. By the time you get to the sort of 25 years of tours, the teams have progressed. And I think there's an interesting point here Pete mentioned there about the interpretation of the laws of the game, and I guess it'll be a thread that'll keep weaving in and out of the conversations we have over the coming weeks. But it's interesting that perhaps it's a bit of a plaster to put on the wounded pride. But apparently the Chelsea players complained about the unfair play of the Argentinian players, and management actually made an official complaint to the Football Association about the non-observance of the laws of the game. Now, whether that contributed to other clubs not going on tours, I don't know. I guess no club want to go on tours and sort of had the bit of a shellacking that Chelsea had. But I'm not sure Chelsea were that good a team in those days. But I think it's important that it recognises that if these clubs going out on tour, not just the British clubs, as the European clubs that Pete mentioned as well, are going there and perceived as being teachers, then it's entirely logical to sort of accept that the pupils have learned and they've progressed. And I think the Chelsea chairman after the tour described the Argentinians as the true masters of tactical play. So they're obviously, that's a compliment, not a sort of an excuse. They obviously have progressed, and why wouldn't they?
Stephen, again, this is something we've sort of talked about in various podcasts and all sorts of discussions, is that almost that insular feeling of superiority. And 25 years is a long period of time. But actually, when you look at it in terms of learning, these teams, the South American teams, learned very, very quickly within a couple of generations of sides. They were more than a match for the supposed strongest team nation in the world. And then like you've mentioned before, you look at Uruguay, and there they are as Olympic champions, and future world champions, and that's 1930, that's only 26 years after, well, maybe Pete's right all along, since Southampton pitched up and sowed the seeds for a nation winning a World Cup.
If you're looking for a similar, parallel, you've got to look at, say, the players of the 1960s, casting off the shackles of the coaches and the influences of those who've been part of a war generation. It's kind of like we've learned so much, but what you're teaching us now, it's just bouncing off us, and we're ready to fly on our own now. I think there's probably a bit of that at play with Argentina and Uruguay by the 1920s, 20 years after you've got Southampton, Everton, Tottenham, and so on and so forth, tipping up to dole out the initial lessons.
A question for you, Peter. I know there's some of the things we want to talk about, but obviously there was a lot of English influence in the early establishment of these clubs and the sporting clubs, etc. Where does this, or how does this fit with regards to patriotism from an Argentinian perspective or a Uruguayan perspective, but also from an English perspective where you may already have that English influence. You might have English people, in charge, maybe in charge of administration or responsible for setting the clubs up, where it must have been quite difficult in terms of sort of demonstrating the patriotism of the nation you live in as opposed to your home nation that's maybe come across, but also the patriotism of the Argentinians who yes want to learn, the Uruguayans who yes want to learn, but then all of a sudden, as we've just discussed, as Gary has put it, very well, actually, they learned and then superseded the teachers that came along.
Yeah, no, I think you have to see these matches as patriotic occasions. As soon as Southampton come, these are vitally important matches for the country. These are important enough for the presidents to turn up to. We have President Roca is there for the Southampton game against Alumni. We have the president is there for the Nottingham Forest game. President Figueroa Alcorta is there to watch Everton against Spurs and do the kind of, I think he even does the ceremonial kickoff. This is an important nation for the an important moment for the country. I think that what you also see is the fans taking it as this. This is a chance for their country to represent themselves against a British country. There are some of these kind of sporting ideas of tests which are in existence. It's mostly cricket at this stage. It is very limited. We have Australia playing some cricket. We have South Africa playing some cricket. So, it's probable that, these people would have heard about these test matches, that the nation is at stake. We only have to think about the first Ashes idea, England's Ashes when they lose to Australia. That's the Ashes of England and English cricket. So, there is this kind of idea that sport is representing the nation. And I think that even though a lot of the surnames that we see with the Argentinian teams, the various kind of Combinado Nortes and so on, and Alumni, a lot of those are British names that we see on the team sheets to start with. But, and I think Matthew Brown in his book Sports in South America makes this point really well, is that these are not necessarily, first generation migrant Brits who've gone across and are now playing. Some of these are the sons of the first generation. These are second generation Brits who have a slightly dual idea of Anglo-Argentinians, or maybe more Argentinian Anglos. So I think that's really important. I think what's really interesting is if you look at the very first Uruguayan team plays against Southampton and Nottingham Forest, I don't think there are any English names there. Certainly the guy who scores the first two goals by Uruguayan teams against Southampton and Nottingham Forest is a guy called Pena. So we see that. And I think that, because of the way that the press are reporting this, there is a sense of us against them. It is the nation's representative against the British representative. And even if these are, professional club teams and not the kind of select 11s that Argentina and Uruguay are putting out, they are seen as, in that moment, representing Britain in some kind of way. And the passion is stoked up to those kind of ends. I think it certainly changes really by, if you look at the post-war teams where the British teams, start returning, you have, as we've talked about, Third Lanark in 1923, Plymouth Argyle 24, Motherwell 1928, and Chelsea 1929. We're seeing teams that are no longer those British surnames anymore. These are Argentinian teams. Now, what there is, and what we have to say, is that there are a lot of kind of Argentinian and Spanish. There are likely to be second generation Italians that are playing for Argentina now. So there has been a slight change in what that representation is. There are still lots of kind of migrant diasporic links, but this has been infused into a much more of a sense of what Argentina is, and it's been creolized. It's been made local. It's less about that British influence. They're not playing against the Combinado Británico or the Argentinian British anymore. They've long gone. Alumni eventually go. As well. So they don't play anymore after, I think, 1914. They don't play against Exeter. I can't remember if they play against Swindon. So that influence, gradually disappears. There's a kind of a progressive erasure of the British influence within the Argentinian football ranks anyway. What's quite interesting, again, some of the local newspapers in Britain that you can see is, there is a kind of sense of pride of these club sides going abroad to represent England or Britain, as a kind of international endeavour. There is that sense of the local press in Britain talking about in those terms as well. So I think the nation is very much present in lots of different ways when these football matches are going on.
Gary, do you think, and you going back to, you talked about question how hard did they try or whatever it is, and that's up for debate unless you were there. But do you think there was an underestimation in terms of the nationalistic importance from the British perspective compared to an Argentine or Uruguayan perspective?
I guess the short answer is yes, and perhaps the longer answer is, did they care? I mean, yeah, it was certainly more important to the Argentine. The results of the game are probably more important to the Argentinian teams or the Uruguayan teams that played as well, rather than to the touring teams. And yeah, it was the nationalism that it promoted, especially when they got good results or took these sort of gods of football close to results. It was important. There's a thing when the alumni beat the South African team, and they were saying it was a quote in La Nación. Says, for our national football, the alumni South African match was a great triumph. We'll be remembered for a long time in everybody's memory. Serving an example and the stimulus for the future. So, there's that. But again, I guess as they progressed, that sort of triumph against a scratch team became less important, strange enough, because they were playing better. They were playing more organised. The clubs that they were playing, the touring teams, were far more. They weren't professional, but more professional outlook, shall we say, rather than just a sort of scratch team. So I think, yeah, it was very much more important for the South Americans, the Argentinians, and the Uruguayans in terms of national promotion. I don't think the British clubs really took it that important of, you're playing for the reputation of England. I don't think that was a factor at all.
Do you want to know some quotes about Brazil against Exeter? So when the Brazilian team beat Exeter at the end of Exeter's tour, the press say, the Correio da Manhã said it was the best sporting achievement of Brazil, a great sporting happening. I mean, you can only imagine if they'd played Southampton, how excited would they have been if they'd beaten Southampton. The national team played an extraordinary game above all expectations. So this is exactly how this is the Brazilian press. The first time they get a professional team over, even though it's a mediocre middle of the league kind of Southern League team, this is the level of excitement that it generates.
For you, Stephen, again, I suppose it's probably quite difficult to say, but do you think that sense of, I mean, clearly Argentina's standing as, as two-time world champion and, currently have the best player in the world in Messi, the best player in the world Maradona, but do you think there is still some undercurrent that exists when clubs play maybe intercontinental? And I know this is something we're going to cover in other episodes, but do you think that still exists when English clubs or particularly English clubs play South American clubs in that intercontinental competition, or when there's international football between England and maybe one of the other South American countries? Do you think that still exists to this day?
What, British superiority?
No, not the superiority. Sorry, the perception of, the nationalistic pride that South American countries take, in particular beating England. So if you look at the cricket analogy of Australia and England, for example, the Aussies, no matter how superior they are, will always take great joy, in beating the English. And do you think that still exists? Even though we're not the superpower that we once were.
I think it probably does to a certain degree, but I think football's become, a different. So it's a different landscape now. And we know this that South American players are picked off at a very young age, and they're Europeanized. They won't look at taking on a European side or England or whoever it is in quite the same light as players were just kind of like 20, 30 years ago. We know exactly what it meant to Argentina to beat England at the 1986 World Cup. Even up to the late 1980s, Brazil and their pride in going to Wembley and winning, was still very, very high. But nowadays, I think it's just, I think less so. I think it's probably more telling at junior levels than it is at senior levels. I think there's still a lot taken from it, but I don't think it certainly wasn't what it was.
Pete, something else that I am interested in is how these games, these tour games, were observed by fans. Either the type of fans, the class of fans, the social standing of fans, but also their behaviour in and around the game while it was on.
Yeah, now this is a really interesting thing as well. I think what we see to start with is the first games are getting about 10,000 people. 8,000, 10,000 people are coming to watch Southampton. I mean, it's probably more than Southampton getting an away game now. Went to River Plate and they said, "Nah, sorry lads, we don't fancy watching Southampton this week." But what we see from the photos, and again, this is if people do want to look at the Viejos Estadios blog, you'll see lots of photos from the old newspapers, and there is a lot. It is clearly a high society occasion. We see women in their finery, we see families, we see the upper classes. So we see a very mixed crowd, and it is the elite of society that's being there. We see the politicians are there, the members of the cabinet are there. This is very much what we see. And certainly in the first year of the Southampton tour, the behaviour is very good, apart from when one of the local teams does well. And then we see kind of exuberant pitch celebrations. And this becomes a bit of a trend of fans invading the pitch for different reasons. It starts off through exuberation, but increasingly it gets slightly more violent. And we have some slightly humorous stories and some slightly scary stories. I think it's in one of the Corinthian tours. There is I think this is an Andres Campomar book that a young black boy invades the pitch and kicks one of the Corinthian players in the unmentionables, and then runs off to great laughter as he is and fails to be apprehended. But then I think it's the Exeter tour when they're playing Racing, if I'm not mistaken. Then apparently the Racing secretary enters the pitch and pulls a gun. And we get increasing reports and increasing complaints from both the Buenos Aires Herald and other British newspapers, and also in some of the tour diaries of some of the chairman directors who go along about the bad behaviour that they experience. We have projectiles being thrown from the crowd. We have, a lot of whistling and booing. We have people not applauding good play of both teams, but becoming increasingly partisan. And these are things that certainly to some extent are also criticised occasionally by some of the Argentinian press as well, that, we need to be showing respect and applaud good football from either sides. But it quickly changes to, this press becoming increasingly violent, increasingly vehement. And often it's in response to what they see as being violent play. We've already talked about, the rules being different, but certainly when British players are charging or using their shoulders or charging the goalkeeper, these are things that for Argentinian or Uruguayan football are anathema. They don't see them as being fair. And maybe this is part of them not understanding the rules. And this is again something that the British press says, that this is in the laws of the game. But the Argentinians and Uruguayans don't understand this. And because presumably these are people who are just becoming enthralled with this social spectacle, that they don't seem to think that type of play is fair. So we have this lack of understanding of the laws of the game as it stands, or this different application of laws, and also this kind of increasingly nationalised idea, but also the kind of local occasion where passions get arisen to a much greater extent. And we do have, we have a lot of problems. There is, one of the games, and I can't remember who it is playing Boca. It might be Plymouth Argyle. Yeah, that was called off. I mean, apparently the Boca took the lead, the crowd invade, and they, they're hoisting the Boca guy who scored on their shoulders. And then Plymouth get a penalty, and the crowd invades. They're not happy with this. They don't want to go ahead. When apparently Patsy Corcoran of Plymouth Argyle says, right, we're not going to score it because they'll go wild. And then, apparently Moses Russell decides to take it, scores, and the pitch is invaded again, and then the game's called off. And this kind of feeds back, and another reason why the British teams start not wanting to go is that they're kind of getting these negative reactions. These stories are in the press about what is happening, and about pitch invasions, about police on horseback drawing their swords and waving their guns around to try and get the crowd back. And it's interesting as well that if the one video I found of some of these tours, and it's a tour by Celta Vigo, and apparently it's the oldest ever coverage of the Celta team. You can see Celta playing against one of the Uruguayan teams, and there is the kind of fencing is already up. The barbed wire, the fencing is there. And that was obviously in response to some of these kind of crowd protests. I think after the 1924 World Cup, I think that's when these fences got up. But that's the extent of it. So there are a lot of reports of this kind of poor behaviour, and it's criticised, in the press for lack of decorum, for too much passion, for too much excitement. And that's something that we'll see, as a constant problem throughout the next decades.
Gary, do you think, it's like creating a monster, isn't it? It's, you create this game and you create this atmosphere around it, you create this environment around it, you place this importance on it, you place this identity on it, you use it for propaganda. There is always going to be that reaction from fans as well. You can't create an entity but then sort of force people to hold back on their emotions.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I was going to mention the thing that Pete just flagged up about the Blocker game and Plymouth, and crowds sort of invade the pitch or climb the fences. Watch a Blocker game on the TV now, and it happens today. You see fans, 6, 10, 12 foot in the air climbing on the fences to their team scores or doesn't score or gets a penalty or it's offside or is a foul or a throw in or a corner or or whatever. So yeah, the passion is a big thing, and I guess there again, it's almost the other side of that nationalism that we discussed earlier. That the press, the Argentinian press, and the government and the clubs as well, were sort of saying this is so important now. We're competing with the best in the world, and if you create that passion, and then you can't really complain when it catches fire.
Yeah, no, you are absolutely right. And obviously, Stephen, for you and I, it's exactly why we love South American football. You can see, as Pete's talked about, and yourself and Gary, you can see the genesis of the South American game, and the personality of the South American game is almost evident from the very beginnings of these tours. It's all like, I talked to you about sort of cherry picking, the best bits and learning, certainly from a technical aspect of the game. But what they also do is they sort of infuse that with a passion and a vibrancy that they've continued to take on and develop, where you could argue that it's perhaps started to dwindle a little bit from our game or the European game.
Yeah, what they basically do is they take the basic lessons that are shown to them by those initial teams, Marcus Brody FC / Southampton, and so on and so forth. But then they personalise it, don't they? They put their own hat on it and put their own flavour to it. And generation upon generation, it's as we mentioned earlier on, it soon changes. They learn very, very quickly, and then they explore the game and the ball and the pitch in their own way. And that temperament it needs to be factored in. And then when it comes to Argentina especially, but then Uruguay and Brazil as well, it's their own sense of superiority over the rest of their own continent, and the fact that they feel like they can soon be going toe to toe with the people who are meant to be the masters of the game over the seas as well. So it as much as they can turn around and say, well, you've taught us all we need to know now. There is a certain degree of reflection in that mirror that they're within the process of smashing.
We've talked jokingly of the Dick Dastardlys of the South American football world, and again, it's part of the reason why we love South American football and the characters that it brings. And I suppose these tours, I guess, would be the birthplace for for some of these characters to become more well known, for certainly some of the escapades to be, when you have so much attention, and certainly from two different countries, anything that is done on the pitch, anything that is done in and around the game is obviously going to be magnified. But like I said, and I suppose a little bit with regards to the vibrancy of the game, I suppose, would it be fair to say that these tour games is where reputations of players or reputations of maybe the style of play was started to be born, or certainly where it was taken notice of on a wider scale?
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I mean, if you're performing well in these games against the best of Britain, it is almost your consecration. The level that we hoped you have is kind of confirmed. So I think that what you see is that, the players that will score the first goals, or for example, the goalkeeper that has a heroic performance, becomes extolled to great hero status in the press. This is something that increasingly happens, and and it starts happening in, I think, 1928 with the Motherwell tour. We start having radio coverage as well. So the deeds of the Uruguayan Peña, who scores against Southampton and Nottingham Forest, makes him a star. And I've forgotten the guy's name. I know it begins with V. I'll have to look it up. It might be Vieso. I can't remember. I think he was a Rosario player. Is rumoured to be impressing Tottenham. That makes him someone who is the star. We see Friedenreich. When he starts playing in the Exeter game, this is again something that makes him a star. And certainly, I think that in some ways, again, this is very much of a pre-First World War thing. I think after the First World War, we have a period of time where the games between Uruguay and Argentina, increasingly between Brazil and Chile, are starting to play as well, are becoming important as national team games, which are establishing themselves as stars in their own rights. They don't have to be playing against these British teams to prove that. They've gained a certain star status of their own. And I think certainly, Gary already mentioned it with some of the match reports of Sam Allen of Exeter, and some of John Hunter of Motherwell, the Plymouth Argyle coach, saying these guys can play. These guys are good enough. And I think really in 1924, that was proved already. When Uruguay win the Olympics, they are star players, and they're star players in Europe as well. But certainly pre-First World War, the players who do well are in the newspapers. They're heroes. They're having, caricatures drawn of them and their successes.
I suppose it would be certainly too naive to sort of state that these tours helped to formulate the South American game, Gary. But I suppose would you say it accelerated the development of South American football? I mean, Pete makes a great point about how, during the 1418 war, it then becomes very much an internal affair within the continent. But is it the sort of the genesis, the development of football in South America? Can it be seen through the lens of these tours?
I certainly think that the football developed quicker because of the contact, the encounters, the sort of the theme of the series with British teams. And, how much did it develop? Well, almost exactly 12 months to the day, well, 12 months and 2 weeks to the day after Chelsea played their last game on tour in 1929. Argentina and Uruguay played in the first World Cup final. Now, I know there were no British teams there, and all the Europeans didn't travel, but you can only beat who was there. And so by 1930, that's the standard Uruguay and Argentina were at. They were contesting the first World Cup final. So, would that have happened so quickly if the British tours hadn't happened? Perhaps not. And I think the only way you test yourself is playing against people who are perhaps better than you, and you have to raise your standard to survive. And that's true in most sort of spheres of life. And you can see the increase in the success that the South American teams and the clubs and the representative teams had as time goes on throughout these tours, shows a clear improvement in their sort of development. And so, yeah, I think it did make how big a difference I don't know, but it did make a marked difference for sure.
One of the sort of question for you, Stephen, do you think the Uruguay national team of 24, 28, 30 and 50, do you think they get the credit that they deserve within the history of the game?
They do and they don't. You say it takes people like us to turn around and talk about the past of the game to keep them alive, and to point out the parallels to where football is today, and the genesis of where today's most relevant footballing nations come from, or even kind of like nations that aren't particularly relevant today that were massively relevant in the past, and the further the past creeps away, the more these teams are gonna they're gonna lose that spotlight.
Yes, and very sadly so. Pete, before we sort of draw this to a conclusion, there's a couple of things. Obviously, one, you've mentioned in passing other sides that went from across the continent. One of those teams was Pro Vercelli. if you've got any information on that, that would be great from a personal point of view. A bit like a historical jukebox there. I've put my 50p in, and I've selected Pro Vercelli, please, Pete, if that's all right. And the other thing I was going to ask is did the tours from other continental sides, I'm trying to ask you, but did they sort of follow the same trajectory as the British teams as well, or was there a trend of different outcomes, or did those tours have a slightly different trend to the UK one?
So what you have as a trend is there being kind of select 11s, slightly more select 11s as opposed to the club side. Pro Vercelli, for example, they have guest players from several teams. They feature players from Novara, from Alessandria, and for Juventus, as well as the Pro Vercelli players. Actually, Torino have the same thing. Torino actually travel in the same year as Pro Vercelli, and they have players from Juventus, from Milan, and Novara as well. And again, they what's interesting about those two teams is they're originally invited out by the different federations of the competing Brazilian footballers. So Torino end up playing games against, I think, the Liga Paulista de Football, the kind of Sao Paulo version. And Pro Vercelli are, however, playing against the APEA version of the league that's going on. So actually, Pro Vercelli actually have the tougher tour. They're playing against some of the kind of club teams that are kind of merging. So they play against Paulistano and a combined Paulistano Scottish Wanderers team. They play against Palmeiras and Mackenzie College. They play against São Bento and Ipiranga. And they play against Botafogo and Flamengo, and then also Fluminense America. So that's kind of Pro Vercelli's team. And it's kind of the same. I mean, we've already mentioned briefly the Portuguese team that went out in 1913 was combined. We also have a Guipuzcoan federation from the Basque Country that go across and play, which is, again, a mix of players between Real Sociedad from Arenas Club de Guecho, from Real Unión de Irún, from Athletic Bilbao, from Esperanza San Sebastián. And there's a couple of great stories from, and again, there's so many anecdotes we could go through. But one of the great anecdotes about that particular tour is that they had a Federación Guipuzcoana featured a guy who was actually in exile from Spain, a guy called José María Belaustegui Goitia, who apparently had shouted death to Spain in a meeting of the Basque National Party, but had also appeared in the Olympics in 1920 when Spain won a silver medal, and had almost been refused to get his medal because he refused to carry the Spanish flag as a kind of an ardent Basque. But he said in his stories that the reason the Federación Guipuzcoana did not do very well is they rather overindulged on the tour, to the extent that apparently they drank the steamer practically dry on the way over, and then indulged a little bit too much on eating, drinking, and merrymaking on the way. So they didn't particularly do well. In fact, they actually had to end their tour early, because they were doing that poorly that no one really wanted to go and watch them. And actually quite a few of the other teams, Barcelona go across and lose most games, Real Madrid lose most games, Torino struggle, Genoa struggle, Celta Vigo struggle, so these are all First World War. So by then we can see that the tide has really turned. I mean, actually the Federación Guipuzcoana Tour aren't the only team to get into a bit of trouble. Exeter City actually got arrested in Rio, because they thought the training facilities weren't good enough. So they went to play football on a private beach and got themselves arrested. And apparently, I think this is probably apocryphal, but there's a lovely line from someone or other who said, "We thought it was okay to swim because Britain owns the waves." Apparently, and again, a lovely little story from McGahey, who was the chairman of Exeter, described Rio as being a bigger Torquay. So I'm not sure what that says about Rio. But yeah, McGahey didn't endear himself to the Latin Americans. He said he'd had a thoroughly miserable time, and was what you do see actually is quite a lot of this kind of racism superiority as well from the likes of McGahey's tour diaries. So there's lots of those kind of stories.
It's funny as you were going through that, Pete. I just had the idea of asking you all your favourite anecdotes to round out the episode. However, though, while you were chatting, Gary, you're more than welcome. You're more than welcome for that comment from Pete that Real Madrid struggled as well. It might have taken us an hour and a half, but we have managed to rescue Chelsea's poor performance and put it into some sort of context for you.
Well, I wish Chelsea were playing like Real Madrid play at the moment. That would be very good.
Well, it sounds like you both did about 100 years ago. So obviously, like I say, we've been going, just over an hour and a half, and it's why we've brought the band back. It's why we're on a third world tour, well, continental tour. But in terms of anecdotes, and again, Pete was kind enough to sort of provide us with websites and research areas for us all. But in terms of favourite anecdotes, because these are always my favourite bits as well, especially whatever the most random thing that Pete's going to come up with about a cigar-smoking donkey scoring the opening goal against Exeter and stuff like that. But anyway, in terms of favourite anecdotes, I'll start with you first, Pete, because you'll have millions. So I'll start with you first, if that's okay.
Okay, well, my first option is amongst the touring entertainments, because again, you have to keep these guys on tour entertained when they're traveling around Buenos Aires. So some of the highlights included going to the meat freezing factories, which is apparently of great excitement. They obviously went to the horse racing quite regularly, the botanical gardens. But my favourite one was that several teams seemed to go and see Frank Brown, the world famous clown. So apparently he was one of the main things to go and see in Buenos Aires. I mean, now obviously we all have Joey Barton as the kind of clown that's all entertaining us, but back in the day it was Frank Brown, the English clown. So there's a little anecdote for you about the travelling entertainment on offer.
Oh, I love that. It's better than going on tour with Joey Barton, I know that. Gary, for you, your favourite anecdote from the South America tours circa early 1900s?
Okay, I mean, I think first one thing of interest, I think I'm right, that when Exeter played Argentina, it was the first time the Argentina team wore numbers. So it's the first time they played against an Argentine number 10. So that's it. Exeter City were the first team to play against an Argentine number 10. In that same tour, Exeter was slated by the press, and I mentioned that they were described as the most mediocre team, and yet they tanked Uruguay 4-0. The reigning Olympic champions, who would go on to retain that title and then go on to win the World Cup. So, the guy who wrote that quote from Tribuna perhaps ought to have a little think about what he said.
Excellent. And for you, Stephen, a favourite anecdote?
I like the story of the third Lanark team who were on the way home, taking them a vast amount of time to get there, and then sailing back via the Canary Islands. They tripped across the Wraith Rovers team who'd been shipwrecked off the coast of Spain.
You're making this up. up.
Absolutely not. This is very, very true. The Wraith Rovers team on a tour of their own had been shipwrecked off the coast of Spain. And another one was Tottenham almost missed that trip with Everton in 1909 as well. They missed the boat from Southampton. They got delayed on the way down to the south coast. They needed a steamer to go and catch up with the ship, which slowed down for them. Of which Walter Tull was part of that Tottenham side that went in that 1909 tour as well. But yeah, Wraith Rovers being shipwrecked, I think that's just one of the greatest unknown or little heralded stories of British football.
I think on that Tottenham tour, I think Val Harris, I'm not sure he was playing for Everton or Spurs, but he came back with a parrot. He bought a parrot in Rio de Janeiro. So he brought a parrot back to be his friend.
There's a great anecdote about Wraith Rovers, and they got promotion. This is going back to the 60s, I think, 60s or 70s. And the guy reading the football results out in the grandstand said, they'll be dancing in the streets of Wraith tonight. Well, there's no such place. Wraith Rovers playing Kirkcaldy, so, great BBC stuff there. And another one, that when the German league football was going to be on BBC or Channel 4, so I can't remember what. And Gary Newborn said, it's still going to be the Borussia Derby.
Anyway,
there you go.
The dancing on the streets of Wraith one always reminds me that when Liverpool played TNS, Total Network Solutions, in the Champions League qualifiers, and tongue-in-cheek, the commentator said when TNS won their game to get through to play Liverpool, that they'd be dancing on the streets of Total Network Solutions tonight.
I think there's the other one that's really nice is the cartoons. And I think there's one cartoon, we've talked a lot about the styles of football and how it changed, and it probably fits well with Motherwell. Like Motherwell, played a game against the Capital Select team in 1928, and one of the ways in which the Argentinian press reacted to the way that Motherwell played was a cartoon of a football that was blooded and bruised, as kind of showing the type of football that Motherwell were playing. And again, I think little has changed in 100 years. Sorry, Motherwell fans.
We're away.
You're not sorry, guys. It's a great first episode. It started with Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it's ended up with Pirates of the Caribbean and everything else in between. First of all, Gary, enjoyed your first close encounter?
Brilliant, absolutely.
Stephen, enjoyed it?
Absolutely. Absolute joy to do, as always.
Pete, obviously, your idea, your brainchild. I can't wait, as always, for what you're going to teach me on the next episode. Now, no pressure. This is your chance to give well, you don't have to, it's your thing, but give us an indirect clue as to what the next episode, what the topic will be.
We're going to role reverse, I think, is the idea, and find out kind of what links the likes of Colo Colo and Rampla Juniors and Sporting Barracas. There's a clue of what we might be talking about next.
They all got shipwrecked off the coast of the Falkland Islands.
Yeah, they all got picked up by Partick Thistle on the way home.
Yeah, had a game against Stenhousemuir off the coast of Marrakesh.
Yeah, they travelled home with a poodle.
That's excellent, Pete. Obviously, once again, Stephen and I look totally perplexed as to what we're doing and when we're doing it. Gary's absolutely nodding and knows exactly what's coming next. And Stephen and I are about 20 minutes behind, but we'll get it once we've gone off air. Guys, thank you ever so much. And again, Pete, thank you ever so much for the series. Well, it makes it sound like it's ended. Thanks for starting the series and opening the series out. All that's left for me to say is thank you for listening, and please join us again next time where we strum up the instruments and see what Pete's going to teach us. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.